So let me begin. In July 2015, I found myself in the midst of conversations with a group of siblings I've known since I first visited the island of Mayotte 40 years earlier. Mayotte's in the Western Indian Ocean. It's part of the Comoro archipelago, but since 2011, it's been a département of France. My slides didn't get through to Diego this morning, but if you can imagine a map of Africa with Madagascar on the right-hand side looking like a big left foot, Mayotte is between, let's say, the middle toe and the mainland of Mozambique there. The population of Mayotte, I should say too, is Muslim. The siblings had been embroiled for a number of years in a bitter and very long-standing dispute concerning an accusation of sorcery that one sister had leveled against another. I had decided that on this visit that I owed it to them and was expected by them to help resolve the dispute. This proved unsuccessful. Indeed, by the end of my stay, I heard about further accusations, new fires springing up faster than I could try to stamp them out. I discussed the conflict between her two older sisters with a third sister, Amina, who had been all along the calmest and most objective. So when Amina confided a further accusation, in my surprise and exasperation, I blurted out, "But that can't be. Sorcery isn't real." What follows is a reflection on both my remark and on the broader context in which it was uttered. I want to think about sorcery through the lens of ethics, and ethics through that of sorcery. There are, of course, many ways to conceptualize ethics. My approach concerns practical judgment and what I've called ordinary ethics, or ethical life, rather than ethics in the sense of explicit problems, sets of rules, or exclusive focus on the good. I see the ethical as a dimension of human action and ethical considerations as part of our lives as humans together. Following Aristotle, I take the ongoing exercise of judgment in the sense of discernment as central. Judgment concerns in part what we say when, and this includes our deployment of concepts, concepts like sorcery, but also here the real and ethics itself. We can say that we are vulnerable to our concepts. The concept of sorcery addresses people's vulnerability to one another, but people are also vulnerable to the concept itself. Encountering sorcery in a fieldwork setting reveals what Sandra Logier calls, quote, the moral capacities or competences of ordinary people, close quote, with respect here to how they deploy the concept. But it also exposes the vulnerability of the ethnographer and his or her own capacities. As Logier says, ethics, quote, is a commitment not to treat anyone as negligible, and it is a sensibility to the details that matter in lived situations. For anthropologists, the subject of sorcery is largely the talk about sorcery, and the ethnographer is inevitably embedded in that talk. Speaking is, of course, central to the philosophical position associated with the ordinary. Following John Austin, we can show how words and concepts offer fine-tuned ethical discriminations, as for example, when we differentiate between having done something by accident or by mistake. Stanley Cavell takes this further. As Logier says, Cavell, quote, defines our relations to our words and expressions in terms of voice and claim. And what is in question are the fortunes and misfortunes of ordinary human vulnerable expression, the search for or loss of the right tone or the right word. This is at once an instantiation of Aristotelian practical judgment and a matter of acknowledgement, of acknowledging those to whom our speech is directed and acknowledging that a given utterance, its tone and wording is ours. Obviously here I'm problematizing my own statement of sorcery being unreal. But now consider the talk of the ethnographer from a different angle. There's a passage in Truth and Method where Hans-Georg Gadamer describes two different kinds of conversation. Here I'm going to read a fairly long quote from Gadamer, so please bear with me. He says, first, there's a conversation that we have with someone simply in order to get to know him or her. That is, to discover their standpoint and horizon. This is not a true conversation in the sense that we are not seeking agreement concerning an object, but the specific contents of the conversation are only a means to get to know the horizon of the other person. Examples are oral examinations, or some kinds of conversation between the doctor and patient. And he says with regarding history now, just as in a conversation, when we have discovered the standpoint and horizon of the other person, his ideas become intelligible without our necessarily having to agree with him. The person who thinks historically in this sense comes to understand the meaning of what has been handed down without necessarily agreeing with it or seeing himself in it. But this means, continues Gadamer, that, quote, we have, as it were, withdrawn from the situation of trying to reach an agreement. By including from the beginning the other person's standpoint in what he's saying to us, we are making our own standpoint safely unattainable. The text that is understood historically, and I would add ethnographically here, is forced to abandon its claim that it is uttering something true. We think we understand when we see the past from a historical standpoint. That is, place ourselves in the historical situation and seek to reconstruct the historical horizon. In fact, however, we have given up the claim to find in the past any truth valid and intelligible for ourselves. Thus, this acknowledgement of the otherness of the other, which makes him or her the object of objective knowledge, involves the fundamental suspension of his or her claim to truth. So that's the end of the quote. Now, if you had to choose the ethical high ground here, I suspect that most contemporary anthropologists would opt for the full or true conversation in which we do not suspend the other's claim to truth or render our own standpoint safely unattainable. And yet, this is not always the position of the ethnographer or evident of ethical sensibility. Take my own declaration that sorcery isn't real. What had I done here? What lack of tact or understanding did I show? What poor judgment or violation of my own rules of conduct or my anthropological sensibility? Or had I shifted to an authentic conversation in Gadamer's sense, one in which our respective claims to truth were at issue? Where does the high road lie? Perhaps this is an ethical situation in the sense of Derrida, namely that the ethical moment is characterized by its undecidability, one in which there is no evident right way forward. But whether that's an excuse or confession on my part, and whether I had spoken by accident or by mistake, are not actually the questions I want to address here. The point is rather how each of us lives with concepts like sorcery, ethnography, judgment, and ethics. The rest of my talk addresses the concept, act, and condition that Kibushi speakers in Mayotte call vodki. Kibushi here is a dialect of Malagasy, and I translate vodki as sorcery. I'm concerned with vodki as a kind of ethical problem, both for inhabitants of Mayotte and for their anthropologists. This is not the problem of vicious behavior per se, that is, of actions directed deliberately against the well-being of others, sorcery itself, but rather the deployment of the concepts vodki and sorcery. One could say here that I'm interested in the ethical life of concepts. Sorcery and ethics are each concepts that form part of our discourse as anthropologists. I suggested some of the confusion evident in the debates in the literature about the nature of both ethics and sorcery is that anthropologists have held a rather naive view of what it means to have a concept, as though it were contained in the expression or definition of a word. We have not always meant the same thing each time we use the word ethics or the word sorcery, or virtually any other word in the anthropological vocabulary. But a larger confusion is that we have often thought that the problem could be resolved simply by recourse to more specific definitions, by discriminating, for example, between ethics and morality, or between witchcraft and sorcery, such that in any given instance we could say, this is ethics and that is morality, or this is sorcery and that is witchcraft. In other words, we have thought the resolution to our problem, a problem that Clifford Geertz once referred to as our semantic anxiety, should be to fix more precise definitions and stricter classification, as though we could lay out our concepts according to a set of binary distinctive features on the model of phonemes. However, interesting concepts do not work this way. Take, for example, the concepts of nature and culture. It takes us down a wrong path to provide them with precise definitions or to conclusively resolve what their relationship to each other is. My argument here follows philosopher Cora Diamond in her essay called Losing Your Concepts, published significantly in the journal Ethics. Diamond distinguishes concepts from narrower forms of classification. She writes, quote, grasping a concept is not a matter just of knowing how to group things under that concept. It is being able to participate in life with the concept. Taking the concept of human being, she says, quote, to be able to use the concept human being is to be able to think about human life and what happens in it. It is not to be able to pick human beings out from other things or recommend that certain things be done to them or by them. Diamond contrasts this with what she critiques as, quote, the limiting philosophical view of language and the idea in it that if a word has descriptive content at all, that content can be expressed by an evaluatively neutral term. Description itself is thought of as something that can be pulled out of the context of human life and interests within which descriptions have their normal place, close quote. Now, of course, this is what anthropologists frequently do as they abstract from their field notes. Against this, Diamond says, quote, I have claimed that the capacity to use a descriptive term is a capacity to participate in the life from which that word comes, close quote. This is obviously a Wittgensteinian point of view, right? Diamond is pointing to a kind of lived social understanding that differs from the ways in which concepts are used in anthropology abstractly and for comparison. Thus, for example, when I turn from the Kibushi concept of vodki to describe sorcery and witchcraft in anthropological discourse. When anthropologists compare, they ask whether a certain practice in a given society can be put under a specific anthropological description. Here, the category of sorcery as we understand it. So our life with anthropological concepts is different from the lives of those who use their concepts in other ways, to understand, diagnose, accuse, attack, justify, suffer, heal, or otherwise describe their acts, relations, conditions, and one another. How anthropologists live with a concept like sorcery, or that of kinship, religion, etc., is different from how Kibushi speakers live with the concept of vodki, how they participate in the life of which the concept is part and to which it contributes. I should just add here that the difference I'm attempting to elucidate is not the same as that of emic versus etic, particular and general, or token and type, nor does it concern rationality in contrast to irrationality. Rather, it concerns different ways of living with a concept. Concepts are not the kind of thing to which ethics is ordinarily applied, and yet when we speak of different ways of living, we are in the realm of ethics, at least as I use or live with the concept of ethics. Ethics as I use the concept is less a matter of following rules than of exercising practical judgment. And when I say judgment, I've been misunderstood in the past. I mean judgment in the sense of continuous discernment, not in the sense of categorical impositions as in a court of law or a prize competition, right? So building on Wittgenstein, Diamond says, we think of learning to use a term as learning to follow the rules for that use. We think of language in terms of rules, fixing what can and cannot be done. But the most important thing about language, I'm still quoting Diamond here, is that it is not fixed in that way. Learning to use a term is coming into life with that term, whose possibilities are to a great extent to be made. Close quote. Learning new concepts is a perennial challenge for ethnographers, and here again, Diamond is helpful. She says, quote, if we get rid of the idea that using a concept is a matter of using it to pick out what falls under the concept and what does not, if we see instead that life with a concept involves doings and thinkings and understandings of many sorts, into which one's grasp of the concept enters in different ways, then we can accept that coming to understand a conceptual life other than our own involves exercise of concepts belonging to that life, close quote. And I would just add here that this resonates with Evans Pritchard, who remarks on how he drew on Zonde concepts to organize his life in the field. Now, clearly all this is relevant for discussions of what we've called cultural relativism and perhaps also for ethical relativism. Despite the fact that Evans Pritchard showed the value and rationality of the concept of witchcraft for Zonde, he's been criticized for his superior attitude. No conceptual sleight of hand on the part of self-identified ontologists can resolve this problem. As anthropologists, we are always situated and always divided in our attachments to diverse forms of life. The point I want to make here about relativism is that it is not itself only an intellectual problem, but a practical one, and hence even itself an ethical matter, not subject to a rule, but to matters of continuous judgment or discernment intrinsic to the form of life that is the activity of anthropology, and perhaps also to the form of life that is citizenship in a pluralist society. In other words, perhaps my mistake was in not acknowledging that insofar as vodki is a concept that belongs to life in Mayotte, it is real there, even if sorcery does not belong and hence is not real to my ordinary life in Canada. The poor judgment on my part concerned which life I was participating in at the time. Excuse me. An earlier anthropological literature debated whether witchcraft and sorcery were one and the same thing or distinct. The consensus, I think, was to not distinguish them, a conclusion that makes sense insofar as they are not discrete ontological phenomena, not distinct objects that exist aside from their cultural elaboration in particular societies, just as ethics and morality are not discrete phenomena. Nevertheless, the result has been that a paradigm of witchcraft has dominated in the literature, leaving in the shadow related but different and possibly less exotic or flamboyant practices. The ethnography of witchcraft typically concerns what could be called the extraordinary, fantasy, symbolic inversions, and often real bodily violence, especially perpetrated on people accused of being witches themselves. Insofar as the terms were distinguished, sorcery was described as deliberate and witchcraft as the product of some kind of primal or acquired drive or condition, such that it could be carried out unconsciously. Witchcraft describes an inverted nocturnal world in which witches consume their fellows or harness technology in mystical ways. In the florid accounts of witches, the ambiguities that attend to matters of intentionality, desire, volition, and will are heightened or covered over. A central existential problem for members of these societies is whether one might be a witch oneself. One doesn't know. The very large question of meaning, in the sense of meaning what we say or do, attaching responsibility to our own actions, is left open. Close inspection of human motivation is displaced by symbolic excess. Now, this is mostly not the case in Mayotte, the case that I'm going to be talking about. In Mayotte, the concept of vodki is broad enough to include fantastical images, and they sometimes appear in conversation, but the common focus is quite mundane. Vodki is not glamorous, exotic, or magical. It's ordinary, if unwelcome and ugly. Part of the way things are, the way human beings and their relationships are. It catches envy, jealousy, aggression, and so forth when they appear, and it elaborates them. It is deeply interpersonal, and when it arises, deeply troubling. Moreover, as found in Mayotte, and as I use the concept, sorcery is an attribute not of persons, sorcerers, but of acts. Sorcery is something one does or commits, not someone who one is. It is in part a matter of using knowledge to harm rather than to help. For example, someone versed in medicines might deliberately give a client the wrong one. In fact, one of the best, if left-handed, compliments I received when I prepared to leave Mayotte after my first year there was that it was a good thing I was leaving, as I had acquired so much local knowledge that I might begin to practice acts of vodki myself, that is, use the knowledge incorrectly. So anyone can do this or can hire someone to do it on their behalf. It's the act that is distinguished as sorcery. Someone would only be called a sorcerer if they had a history of such acts attributed to them. This approximates the distinction Foucault notes in the historical transition in European societies from recognizing acts with same-sex partners to essentializing persons as same-sex oriented. That is, from committing homosexual acts to being homosexuals. And of course, it applies not only in discourses of sexuality, but in other fields. One can distinguish committing a crime from being a criminal, drinking too much from being an alcoholic, and so forth. Such conceptual distinctions, we can all agree, I think, are ethically significant. As people in Mayotte use the concept, vodki applies in the first instance to acts and only rarely becomes an attribute of persons. One can be forgiven for an act of vodki. Nevertheless, there is a general stickiness to it. By stickiness, I mean that once an accusation has been voiced, all parties find it difficult to retract or move beyond it. An event of vodki generally begins with a diagnosis on the part of an astrologer or healer, possibly in response to existing suspicions. An authoritative diagnosis is generally one made by someone at arm's length from the sufferer. A diagnosis, however, is not an accusation. As my mentor, Tumbu Vita, a notable healer of sorcery, repeatedly pointed out, it's wrong for the diagnostician or curer to name the sorcerer, even when he or she knows their identity. The ideal and most common scenario is simply to have the sorcery extracted and to move on. Once an accusation is made, however, one is stuck with it, no matter the protestations of dismay and innocence on the part of the accused. As one accusation then leads to another, things get stickier and people find themselves more and more stuck in accusations, recriminations, and suspicions. It's difficult to come clean, to become unstuck, to move forward without impediment. If vodki therefore expresses moral unease, equally living with the concept is uneasy. When and how is it right to suspect vodki, to raise it, to respond to it? Vodki attributes misfortune to the deliberate act of another. The act is occult in the sense of being hidden, but it is explicit on the part of the perpetrator and it is evident to God. At bottom, the means are not paranormal or extraordinary. They occur at two registers, the material and the ethical. Materially, as I've suggested, vodki is understood as deliberately applying a kind of knowledge for bad rather than good ends, as when an astrologer provides a client with the wrong date on which to carry out something important. Sometimes it's described quite materially as poisoning. On the ethical register, the act of sorcery is one of privately rendering oneself accountable before the fact for a misfortune that may befall the intended victim. This is central to the concept of vodki as I've come to understand it, albeit it is not always explicitly stated. Accountability is assumed, taken on, in the act of sorcery. Indeed, assuming responsibility for someone's anticipated misfortune is what the act of sorcery most fundamentally is. It consists of a performative act or acts whose aim and consequence are not to materially produce the misfortune, that is in God's hands, but to take responsibility for it. It is not performed before any human witness, but only in God's hearing. It is to say, in effect, I acknowledge that should so-and-so suffer misfortune, it was my will and desire that this happen, and I take responsibility for my words. The performative act renders coate and certain the wish for harm to befall another person. One could say that it acknowledges the anticipation of schadenfreude, the pleasure in another's misfortune, that it realizes that intention. And so this obviously obviates controversy about the ontological reality of sorcery, a fact that I myself overlooked in my intervention. As Cora Diamond suggests, an understanding of what is real and unreal can emerge through the investigation rather than preceding it. So in other words, as I've said, the act of vodki is understood to be one of taking on accountability before the fact. Hence, the ethical register is intrinsic and fundamental. Whatever the talk of material means or the assistance of spirits, the act is understood in the first instance to take place on the ethical plane. Whether or not the act is revealed through a subsequent accusation, the sorcerer understands from the start that he or she is accountable. Sorcerers are accountable to God and to themselves. Their act establishes that whatever God's plans for the other person, they will be happy enough to see that person suffer, that they are willing eventually to face God for it. This means as well that sorcery is not subject to human retribution. Punishment is reserved for the afterlife. Vodki then is most fundamentally a matter of accepting responsibility before the fact for the harm to befall someone else. There is nothing fantastical or paranormal about this. Moreover, people are very clear that vodki cannot kill. Death comes only from God. That is, no human can be fully accountable for the death of another, precisely the inverse of the Zande case. Nevertheless, as people talk about vodki, as they live with the concept, the distinction between assuming responsibility and material causality is often elided. And this is precisely one of the mistakes that I myself made in saying sorcery was not real. It should be clear that in its social manifestation, vodki is less a matter of committing sorcery than of suffering its effects. That's true for the whole witchcraft and sorcery literature. That it has to do with suffering the effects, diagnosing and healing the condition, and occasionally accusing an ostensible perpetrator or facing an accusation. In the latter case, the accused vociferously denies the accusation. Now, I would say that my stance towards vodki has changed over time. I've been doing field work in Mayotte for a very long time. Initially, I was receptive, acknowledging like a good Gadamerian that the other might be correct and trying to figure out how that might be so. I was deeply engaged in following healers and found it exciting and fulfilling work as I reached a fuller understanding, and I describe this in my book, Knowledge and Practice in Mayotte. The diagnoses, interpretations, and cures often made sound psychological and social sense, but my grasp of the concept was always as an outsider, albeit a sympathetic one. I did not, for example, consider that I could either practice sorcery myself or fall victim to it. So in a sense, you could say my conversation, as Gadamer phrased it, was not a real one. While that stance was respectful as a guest and student in Mayotte, it came to seem insufficient by later visits. I had learned a good deal about vodki and its treatment from Tumbu Vita and his wife, Moheja Salim. I had also become part of their family. With the death of Tumbu and Moheja, each a person of strong and upright character, their adult children experienced increasing vulnerability. There came as well expectations that I speak and act with them in critical situations. For example, they invited me and I participated in the mortuary ceremonies for their parents. When the suspicion arose that the siblings were victims of one another's sorcery, and with the knowledge that they were victims of one another's accusations, I felt I was expected to step in, and I came to expect it of myself. The conflict began between the two oldest sisters, then in their 50s, over succession to the spirits that had possessed their parents. I've described the dynamics of this elsewhere in an article in AE from 2011, but the key point is that the older sister, Nuriati, who was already possessed by many of these spirits, was evidently disconcerted and plausibly envious when the next younger sister, Mariam, actively possessed for the first time, appeared to receive all the spirits that had visited their parents. Nuriati was serving as the healer presiding over Mariam's initiation, and when the installation of the spirits did not proceed smoothly, Mariam accused Nuriati of deliberately undermining the process, that is, of committing vodki against her. The accusation was supported by an outside healer who announced that Nuriati had come to him for medicine to render the spirits non-viable in her sister. Mariam subsequently exhibited severe symptoms for over a year and went in search of distant curers. When the spirits did rise in Mariam, they asserted that they had been given poison by Nuriati and that Mariam herself would only be healed when they were. Mariam's version prevailed. In humiliation, Nuriati moved away to the village of her husband, thereby appearing to confirm her lack of interest in supporting her younger siblings. I should say when parents die, the oldest sibling of a set of siblings is often referred to then as the parent and should take on the parental role. And Nuriati was the oldest of all her siblings. Both sisters, Nuriati and Mariam, were hurt and angry. By 2015, Nuriati's husband and older son had died. Nuriati was ill and people felt very sorry for her, me included. So I arrived in Mayotte determined to do what I could. I didn't have great illusions that I could resolve the problem, and as it turned out, I failed. But I did make an effort. I was no longer the neutral observer that I had once attempted to be. I discussed the matter with the siblings and their kin. They all said they were deeply unhappy with the situation, that they supported my efforts, and that they wanted nothing more than a resolution and wished for their oldest sibling to come home. Nuriati herself longed to return, but refused to acknowledge any responsibility, without which, Mariam asserted, she could not be reconciled. Not only was the quarrel unresolved, but it turned out that further accusations between other siblings had taken place in the meantime. The siblings not directly involved were forced to pick sides or made to look as though they had. There were hurt feelings, resentment, sadness, and a good deal of embarrassment that they couldn't get along. Mariam seemed happily engaged with her thriving children and grandchildren, and at first she told me the quarrel was over. Yet she fluctuated in what she said about Nuriati. She lamented that they were no longer close as they had been before their mother died, but she also criticized her for neglecting the family. A few days later, I went to visit Nuriati, whom I had not seen in many years. As soon as we were alone, she began to describe her situation. She looked straight at me throughout, her eyes occasionally glistening with tears, but never breaking down. Her younger siblings, she said, quote, threw me out like an empty sack of rice once the contents are consumed. At first, Nuriati told me she didn't know why they were avoiding her, but as our conversation continued, she admitted the root of the problem was sorcery, vodki. She volunteered that spirits had risen in Mariam and announced that she had done sorcery to make Mariam sick. This was confirmed to Mariam by another healer who had once been Nuriati's own apprentice. We talked about other family members, and she laughed over an old story in which two elderly kinsmen had each accused the other of doing vodki against him. At this point, I asked Nuriati, a woman who had followed her father's career as an extractor of sorcery, that is, a healer, whether sorcery in general was real. To my surprise, she said she didn't think so. It is just the sufferer's rohu that feels it. Rohu means a person's consciousness, their soul, or being. In other words, the experience of feeling victim to sorcery may be real, but not necessarily as the direct effect of someone's malevolent action or intention. Nuriati mentioned several attempts at mediation by senior relatives, but Mariam had remained unsatisfied. When I said her younger siblings complained that she never visited them, Nuriati laughed bitterly and said, "How can I? What could I do there? They don't like me." As she is their older sibling, they should come and visit her first. Quote, "A child visits their mother before the mother visits the child." Nuriati concluded, "What's going to happen? One or the other of us will die, and then what?" Suggesting the vanity of maintaining the quarrel and the risk it might never be concluded. As soon as she discovered where I had been, Mariam interrogated me. I reported that Nuriati was sad and wanted to end the situation. "She said that, did she?" retorted Mariam. Mariam then said that Nuriati had been ill-disposed to them since their father's death. Nuriati had done vodki against her, making her very sick. Each time Nuriati came to visit, Mariam was sick afterwards. She went to doctors in the hospital, but they found nothing wrong. I said to Mariam, "Illness comes from God, not from vodki." Mariam retorted, "If you ask God for something, he always gives it to you. If you ask for something good, it often comes slowly. But if you ask for something bad, it can come right away." And that, of course, validates what I had said about what sorcery is. I tried other tactics. I said that back in her father's day, it was forbidden for sorcery extractors to name the sorcerer. The healer who named Nuriati had since died. Perhaps he died as a result of his act. Mariam said that she didn't believe at first that it was Nuriati the culprit, not until this healer came to ask her forgiveness. He had been Nuriati's own apprentice. They'd worked closely together. Now he told Mariam it was her older sister who had done this to her. I told Mariam that the apprentice in question had repeatedly fabricated things to me in the past, which was in fact the case. He was one of those terrible informants who likes to lie to the ethnographer. She said maybe the problem was just Shaitwan, and I agreed. Shaitwan are unnamed and generalized devilish spirits, understood to tempt, pollute, and harm people. The term Shaitwan is often used when people behave badly and no one wants to apportion blame. "Now," said Mariam, "the whole family is caught by Shaitwan that make people distrust each other and sow trouble." Mariam was close to tears as she said how bad it was for siblings not to look out for each other. I reinforced this by saying surely their deceased parents were unhappy. She agreed, saying she often saw them at night in her sleep. She repeated how well she and Nuriati used to get on, talking, visiting, and helping each other. We concluded that the source of the quarrel might be Shaitwan and that we should gather the family to conduct a Muslim prayer and sacrifice to remove the Shaitwan. The only problem was lack of sufficient men, as their brother, Musa, was unlikely to appear. Musa himself was quite aggrieved, saying that kin no longer cared for each other. His sisters, in turn, complained that Musa never visited them. Someone outside the family whispered to me that it was now Mariam who was doing sorcery. In fact, it had shifted from one sister to the other, and it was now aimed at the brother. This was why Musa stayed away. In other words, the idea is that Mariam now was committing sorcery against Musa. The third sister, Amina, explained that Musa's wife, Hidayah, had seen a creature, that is a shaitwan, hovering above their bed at night. She went to an astrologer to ask the meaning of it. He told her the evil creature had been sent by Mariam. Amina herself was shocked when Musa told her that Mariam was doing vodki against him. Amina then started seeing their parents in her sleep, crying and very sad. Musa was sick, concluded Amina, because their parents were angry. So here again, we have another kind of explanation going on. There's multiple interpretations of what's happening. On Amina's advice, Musa had agreed to have a prayer held on his behalf. Musa then improved, but subsequently he furiously accused Amina of being in cahoots with Mariam. He said he wouldn't come to see her anymore, and indeed he hadn't shown up since. Musa had a daughter who was raised by Amina and who was to receive a house plot adjacent to hers on her marriage. But Musa held his daughter's wedding at his own home. He did not invite Mariam, and he refused to let his daughter accept Amina's house plot. Weddings should be planned and produced cooperatively by the entire family, and the sisters were very hurt. When Musa did not turn up to greet them at the end of Ramadan, Amina speculated that perhaps Hidayah had done medicine in order to make him distrust his sisters. Note here, she called this medicine rather than vodki. There's a very fine line between them. Mariam eventually admitted to me that she knew that Musa had accused her of vodki against him. But as he was avoiding all the siblings, she concluded the problem must be Shaitwan. Amina's husband Suf said that Musa was acting badly in ignoring his sisters and refusing to hold a mediation. Suf said that if you feel you are suffering from vodki, you should recite certain verses of the Quran to yourself and it will go away. In effect, here, both Mariam and Suf were reframing the problem of vodki with reference to Islam. A spirit had risen in Mariam to announce that when Musa failed to invite Nuriati to his daughter's wedding, Nuriati had spitefully done medicine so that he would be at odds with all the siblings. This explained why, although he accused only Mariam of conducting sorcery against him, he shunned all of them. So again, Mariam is projecting it onto Nuriati. Amina felt caught between her older sisters. One evening, I went with her to call up the spirits in Mariam. I asked for a male spirit with whom I had had very good relations when he had appeared in their mother. The spirit said the problems in the family were large, but got very agitated when I suggested they might not be caused by vodki. He said heatedly that Nuriati had made Mariam sick. Nuriati had not stood up to acknowledge the situation, had not confronted her accuser, had not helped Mariam while she was ill, nor taken parental leadership when their parents died. The spirit was sure Mariam would not visit Nuriati for a reconciliation. That could only happen if Nuriati came to her. Moreover, they would have to call a healer to remove Shaitwan before they could either hold a Muslim prayer or a mediation. If we removed the Shaitwan, Musa might come to his senses and participate. The spirit here was much blunter than Mariam herself. It's a male spirit, accused me of not accepting his presence in Mariam. He said that as I was in Mayotte for only a short time, I would be unlikely to manage a reconciliation. He rejected my implication that Mariam ought to step forward and take the high road. He said that Nuriati wanted a reconciliation only now that she herself was sick and alone. He dismissed my idea that each sister asked the forgiveness and goodwill of the other. During our conversation, Amina looked down at the ground and said virtually nothing. When the spirit left and Mariam came to herself, she asked what had transpired. She then said, contrary to the spirit, that she was willing to go visit Nuriati with me. However, on the day planned for the trip, she refused to go. It's evident that Mariam was conflicted. While at one level she felt badly and wanted to resolve the conflict, at another she remained deeply angry with her sister and was telling me that no reconciliation was possible unless her feelings were to change. As for the ceremony to remove Shaitwan, Amina added insightfully that a person needs to want the Shaitwan gone. Otherwise, you can hold the ceremony to remove them, but nothing will happen. Musa did not keep appointments with me, and I ran into him only several days later at a wedding that we were both attending. Amina was there as well, though Musa did not acknowledge her presence. When I suggested a reconciliation to Musa, he got angry and he prodded me with his finger. Did I think that by dropping in here I could fix things? When I asked why he wouldn't visit his sisters, he told me to ask them. He said they knew perfectly well why, but they were ashamed to admit it. He wouldn't visit them and he didn't want them to visit him. Even Amina, I asked? Musa replied, Amina is like a TV set, tuned now to this channel, now to that. He was adamant that I could do nothing and that he was not ready to budge. The conflict could persist until they died. Musa charged me angrily that I couldn't know what was in his heart, his rohu, and that even if one could fix things by speech, that is, he used the word for tongue, it wouldn't help if there was no real change of heart, that is, rohu. Without a change in feelings, a verbal reconciliation would be useless. Amidst all these recriminations, Amina had been the most level-headed and the sibling I most counted on to assist the reconciliation. Therefore, I was disconcerted when she revealed one evening that the spirits had long since informed her that her children's problems in school had been caused by Nuriati. When I suggested that maybe the spirits in Mariam weren't objective, Amina said she hadn't asked them, but she had sought out spirits and hosts far afield. Spirits in two different mediums in other villages said the same thing. The problem stemmed from the eldest sister. They didn't make allusions, but they said it directly. It was at this point that I expostulated that sorcery was not real. My remark took me by surprise. It was not only tactless and wrong, but an instance of what Diamond terms deflection, which she describes as, quote, what happens when we are moved from the appreciation of a difficulty of reality to a philosophical or moral problem apparently in the vicinity. Amina responded by returning to the rough ground, describing how one of her sons, who previously had had a good relationship with Nuriati, became troubled by visions of her in his sleep. He went as far as metropolitan France to escape her and has felt better since his arrival there. Amina now admitted that this was the main thing that troubled her about Nuriati, that she could turn on Amina's own son, that her son's life was damaged. That's why she broke with Nuriati, though she never told her directly. I suspect she also retained some doubt that Nuriati had actually done this. Certainly she was not full of the hostility that Mariam and Musa exhibited. Both Mariam and Musa told me it was too early to fix things. They each suggested that when I next return to Mayotte, I will see that things are fine. Everyone will be getting along. But they said, not yet. The relatives who observed the situation with sadness were less optimistic and condemned their stubbornness. An aunt of theirs, Zara, with whom I spoke, said she felt very sorry for Nuriati, sick and alone. She thought Mariam should just get over it. Quote, who knows what happened? One says she did vodki, one says she didn't. And now Musa is claiming to be a victim of vodki from Mariam. Enough already with the vodki. Zara then said of the siblings, what happens if one of them dies? They will be punished in the afterlife. People are supposed to look out for one another. God will punish them. I should add that Zara has become a very pious Muslim. Zara added that she herself didn't believe in vodki. She said, I trust in God. It is Shaitan who put ideas of vodki in people's heads. And so to conclude, my point here is not the truth or reality of vodki. It's rather that vodki as a concept is lived with quite differently by people in Mayotte than the way that anthropologists live with sorcery as a concept. In the language game of anthropology, I use sorcery to describe and perhaps theorize. In Mayotte, vodki is approached through what Lagier calls the moral capacities or competences of ordinary people. Vodki is available as a concept among a cluster of other concepts to address unhappy conditions. Vodki expresses what I've called the stickiness of social relations, and once announced, it exacerbates that stickiness. It attaches people to one another in unwanted ways, allowing them neither autonomy nor positive mutual being. The ugly thoughts of the sorcerer invade the being of the victim, and the ugly thoughts of the accuser invade the being of the accused as well. Each attempt to pull away, to drop the stickiness, seems only to disperse it elsewhere. Yet, despite the viscosity and the viciousness of accusations, people acknowledge their vulnerability to each other, exhibit mutual care, are attentive to their experience. Vodki is placed in relation to other concepts such as Shaitan and the Rohu, and even to God. The siblings were caught in an impasse, but they did reflect on it. They tried to extricate themselves, and they did experiment with other descriptions. My judgmental tone with Musa was a failure on my part, as was my dismissal of vodki as not real to Amina. These were instances of incontinence of the sort I exhibit as a free-spoken, grumpy old professor back home. Yet this was also a moment in the history of Mayotte when one could begin to say things like, I don't believe in sorcery. Sorry? One could begin to say things like, I don't believe in sorcery, or even, I'm an atheist. I took my cue in this respect from a minority of young people who had spent time in metropolitan France, but also some pious individuals like Zara and even Nuriati herself. Late in my conversation with Zara, she said she had always wondered what vodki is. Is it poison or something else? What did I think? I said I thought it was mainly words, words that people come to accept, and she agreed. So thank you. That's the end of the talk.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was really